The north is cold and full of whispers.
The tower had no name that anyone remembered. It rose from the red rock of the Dornish mountains the way old teeth rise from a dying jaw, crooked, pale, and wrong in a way that was hard to name precisely. Locals called it the Tower of Joy, because someone had once called it that, and names cling to stone long after the people who gave them are gone. 7 men rode to its base in the early morning. The sun was barely up, the mountains cold in a way that surprised men who expected Dorne to be only heat and dust. There was grit in the wind. The horses were tired. The men were worse. Eddard Stark was one of those men. He had ridden for weeks. He had buried friends along the way. His sister was in that tower, and he did not know what he would find when he reached her. And he had not let himself think about it. He was the Lord of Winterfell. He had a war to finish. He would let himself think about it afterward. 3 knights waited in the shadow of the tower. White cloaks. The Kingsguard. Gerald Hightower, Lord Commander, white-haired and still as old stone, a man who had not retreated from a fight in 40 years of service, and who looked at the 7 approaching riders with the expression of a man who had already made his calculations and was at peace with them. Oswell went beside him, lean and dark-eyed, with a mouth bent into something that was not quite a smile. And Arthur Dayne. Dawn was in his right hand, the ancestral blade of House Dayne, forged from the metal of a fallen star, pale as milk glass, carrying a faint luminescence that did not come from the sun. Even sheathed it was impossible. Drawn and held loosely in the hand of the man who had earned the right to carry it, it looked like an argument that could not be answered. Ned had seen good swordsmen. He had trained beside Robert Baratheon, whose violence was like falling rock, enormous and inevitable. He had watched men he trusted die in this war. Men who were skilled, who were brave, who had been good enough until they weren't. He had some measure of what fighting looked like at its limits. He looked at Arthur Dayne standing in front of that pink tower with Dawn at his side, and understood immediately, without any capacity for self-deception, that he was looking at something outside the scale he had been using. He drew his sword anyway. His sister was in that tower. There was nothing else to do. The fight was not what the songs would later make it. Songs require time and space and a building of pressure. What happened in the red dust below the tower had none of these things. Hightower and Went engaged the flanks, and men began dying on both sides. Good men, men whose names Ned knew, men who had ridden hundreds of miles in rain and cold for this moment. And Arthur Dayne moved through the center of it with the absolute economy of something engineered rather than born. He did not hurry. He did not overextend. He wasted nothing. Not a step, not a word, not a breath. Every exchange lasted 3 or 4 beats and ended with someone on the ground, and it was always one of Ned's men on the ground, and Arthur was already elsewhere before the body had finished falling. He fought with both blades, Dawn in his primary hand, a castle-forged sword in his left, and the combination was a language Ned did not speak. He moved to close with Arthur because someone had to. Because his men were dying, and someone had to. And he was Eddard Stark of Winterfell, however new that title was, however heavy it sat. He held his own for 30 seconds against the finest swordsman in the history of the 7 kingdoms. That is worth stating plainly. 30 seconds against Arthur Dayne at full engagement was not a small thing. It was a meaningful thing. It just was not enough. Howland Reed moved. Ned caught it at the edge of his vision, Howland sliding wide and left, circling the exchange, bleeding through his shirt from a wound in his side, but moving with quiet purpose. He had found the angle. Arthur's right shoulder. The gap above the pauldron where armor left a space no sword could fill without a very precise thrust or a very close knife. The knife was up. The hand was steady. The knife went forward. Arthur's head did not turn. His eyes stayed on Ned, but his weight shifted, barely, less than 2 inches, backward and left, and the blade kissed the curved steel of the pauldron and skidded wide, ringing off with a sound like a coin dropped on stone. It took less than half a second. Arthur completed the rotation he had already begun. He caught Howland Reed's wrist with his free hand, not hard, just efficiently, and pushed. Howland went down. He did not get up. Then Arthur turned back to Ned. Ned had pressed in during that half-second, the right instinct, the only instinct. He had almost made it matter. Almost. The end came the way endings come when one of the men is Arthur Dayne, not with drama, not with ceremony. Just, cleanly and fast, and without apology. Eddard Stark died with his sword in his hand, on his feet, facing his opponent. He had given everything he had against a man he could not beat, and he had given it honestly, and there is no shame in any of it. Arthur did not take satisfaction in it. He stood in the moment after with a specific silence around him, the kind that lives where something irreversible has just happened, and he breathed twice. Then he turned and climbed the stairs. The smell hit him before the door, blood and fever sweat and the ghost of something sweet underneath, flowers maybe, dried petals left by someone trying to make a dying room into something other than what it was. The staircase was narrow. The door at the top was not fully closed. He pushed it open. Lyanna Stark lay on the bed, what had been a bed, 17 years old, and the face men wrote poems about was gray now, the skin pulled tight over the bones beneath, her eyes burning with the specific heat of a fever that had gone too far to come back from. A wet nurse sat in the corner with her hands folded in her lap and said nothing when Arthur entered, because she had understood hours ago that there was nothing left to say. In Lyanna's arms, wrapped in cloth that was barely adequate, was the smallest thing Arthur had seen in his life. Dark hair, barely any of it, plastered flat and damp. A face still folded and new, still deciding what it was going to be. The eyes, when they caught the light, were gray, not purple, not silver, not the violet of a dynasty that had just been burned off the face of the world. Gray, the color of northern granite, the color of every winter sky above Winterfell for 1,000 years. Arthur understood what that meant. He was still looking at the child when Lyanna said his name. Arthur. He crossed the room. He knelt. The stone was hard against his knee, and he did not notice. His name, Lyanna said, and stopped, and made herself continue as Aegon. Her hand found his arm. Her grip was the last strong thing left in her. He is Rhaegar's son. Rhaegar's true son. Promise me, Arthur, a breath, shallow and wet. Promise me you'll keep the secret until the time is right. Not for me, for the realm. Arthur looked at the child for a long time. He had served House Targaryen since he was old enough to hold a sword. Not blindly, he was not a blind man. He had chosen it, and kept choosing it, every morning of his adult life. He had protected this tower because he believed in what was inside it. Because Rhaegar had believed in it. Because someone had to believe in something, or the whole of it was just men killing other men until no one was left standing to remember why. He still believed that. He just had to decide what it was pointing at now. I have never broken my vow to a Targaryen, Arthur said. I do not intend to begin now. Lyanna's grip eased. She did not say anything more. She did not need to. The wet nurse was crying quietly in her corner, and the room got smaller and quieter, and after a little while there was only Arthur and the infant, and the sound of a city somewhere far to the north burning itself down to choose a new king. He sat until it was done. Then he stood, lifted the child from her arms with more care than he had ever handled anything in his life, and wound the cloth tighter against the cold. He went down the stairs. He walked past 9 men who had died for different reasons, and with different levels of understanding of why, and he did not look at any of them. He found his horse. He mounted one-handed, the infant held against his chest, and settled the reins with his free hand. Dawn hung at his hip, pale, catching the morning light and holding it. He did not look back at the tower. He rode south, and the red mountains closed around him, and the world above that tower remained exactly as empty as it had been before any of them arrived. He came through the servants' entrance, not because he was ashamed, because he was thinking clearly. And a man who was thinking clearly about his situation did not ride up the main approach of his ancestral home at midnight with a stolen Targaryen infant and a set of clothes that told the complete history of what had happened at the Tower of Joy to anyone with functioning eyes. The white cloak was dark now, dark in the way white things go dark when they have been in close contact with enough blood and red dust and the general ruin of an afternoon that ended 9 men's lives. He dismounted in the stable yard. A boy of 12 was asleep on a hay bale and startled upright at the sound of hooves. The boy saw Arthur's face and went very still. The way animals go still when they are trying to decide which direction to run. "Wake no one," Arthur said. "Take the horse, feed it and water it, and say nothing to anyone until morning. Can you do that?" The boy nodded. His eyes had moved to the bundle at Arthur's chest and were having difficulty leaving it. "Good," Arthur said. He went inside. He found Ashara in the solar on the 3rd floor, which was where she always went when she could not sleep. This had been true since she was 11 years old. She would sit with a candle and a book she was not reading, and in the morning she would have the specific exhausted composure of someone who had been alone with bad thoughts for a very long time and had learned to wear it without complaint. She was sitting with a candle and a book she was not reading when her dead brother walked through the door with a baby. The candle was on the table between them. She did not move. The book was still open in her hands. Arthur could see, in the small preserved moment before she processed what she was looking at, the exact shape of who she had been before everything changed. The girl who danced at Harrenhal with Elia Martell's ladies-in-waiting, who had her brother's dark hair and her own purple eyes that men from 3 kingdoms had written embarrassing poetry about. Then she processed it. She set the book down with a deliberateness that was the controlled version of dropping it, and she stood, and she crossed the room, and she put both hands on his face. On his actual face, pressing her palms against his jaw, and said nothing for a long time. "You're warm," she said finally. "I kept thinking." She stopped. "I heard what happened at the Trident. I heard about Elia. I heard about the children." Her hands dropped. "I heard you were at the tower. I thought, everyone thought. I know. I was going to hold a service. I had already spoken to the Septon about Ashara." She looked at the bundle at his chest. Her face did the thing faces do when they are doing several things at once and haven't decided which one to let show. "Whose child is that?" Arthur sat down, because he had been awake for 2 days and his legs had earned it. He settled the infant carefully against his arm, made sure the cloth was secure. And then he looked at his sister and told her everything. The tower. The vow. The 3 names he could not now unname. Rhaegar, Lyanna, Aegon, the gray eyes that had looked up at him on a fever-soaked bed in the mountains, carrying every Stark winter that had ever existed in their color, giving away nothing of the silver dynasty that had made them possible. Ashara sat across from him and listened without interrupting, which was not her natural way. When he finished, she was quiet for long enough that the candle moved through a noticeable portion of its life. "What are you going to do?" she said. It was not quite a question. "Disappear." She looked at him steadily. "Explain the logic." He did. He laid it out the way he laid out footwork, in sequence, each step preceding the next with a reason. Robert Baratheon was king. Robert Baratheon had, in the first days of his kingship, allowed the presentation of Elia Martell's children wrapped in Lannister cloaks as a demonstration of a completed problem. Whatever Robert's feelings about that particular act, the outcome had been accepted. A Targaryen infant, delivered to King's Landing under any framing, with any claimant or protector, would become a political piece, leverage, liability, a thing to be used and then disposed of when it became inconvenient. Political pieces did not survive to adulthood in King's Landing. The recent evidence on this point was fresh and comprehensive. If Arthur surrendered himself, he died, and the child went with him or after him. If Arthur contacted Doran Martell, a man with every legitimate reason for grievance and no capacity to act on it safely, he placed the child inside a Dornish political crisis that would consume everything before it produced anything. If Arthur kept the secret and trained the child in complete obscurity until the child was capable of being undeniable, that was the only play. Not because it was comfortable, because every other option shortened the child's life to a political season. Ashara listened to all of it. Then she said, "You'll need me to be dead. Yes, my body won't be recovered. No, the coastline makes that plausible. The household will be devastated." "I know." She stood and moved to the window. Below, the summer sea was doing what it always did, moving, vast, indifferent to the size of the problems being negotiated above it. She looked at it for a while. "She was my friend," Ashara said. "Elia, she used to." A pause. "She used to apologize for Rhaegar's obsessions. as if she was responsible for the things her husband became interested in. She would say, "I'm sorry he's strange about this," and she'd make a particular face, and we'd laugh about it. Another pause. Rhaenys used to hide under the table during meals and grab people's ankles. Arthur said nothing. 3 years old, Ashara said. She was 3 years old. She turned from the window. Her face had made its decision. "I'll do it. I'll do all of it." But Arthur, she looked at the child. He is going to know, eventually, what it cost. What it cost everyone. You have to make sure he's worth it. That's the plan. That's not good enough. I'm not asking about plans. I'm asking about the boy. Who are you going to make him? Arthur looked down at the infant. The child was awake, had been awake through most of the conversation, dark gray eyes open, and moving with the unfocused attention of something very new, trying to understand a world that was not going to be gentle with it. "Someone who deserves to know," Arthur said. It was not a complete answer. Ashara accepted it because she understood him well enough to know it was the most honest thing he could say at 2 a.m, with 9 men's blood still on his sleeve. They spent 3 days arranging it. Ashara was seen in distress. She was seen walking to the sea tower in the early afternoon on the 3rd day, her hair loose, her eyes red. She was not seen returning. The servants who found the empty tower and the open window were not performing their grief. They loved her, and they searched the rocks below for hours, and they found nothing, and the finding of nothing hollowed them in the specific way that no body makes everything permanent, and nothing resolved. The septon was called. The household gathered. The service was quiet and terrible in the way of services for people who die young and whose bodies cannot be confirmed. Arthur stood in the back, dressed as a servant, holding an infant that no one connected to anything because nobody was looking for one. On the last night before he left, he went to the family vault. Dawn was where it belonged. On the stand that had held it between its wielders for 3 generations, cleaned and silent, the milk-glass metal holding its faint light in the dark, the way coals hold warmth after the fire has gone cold. He stood in front of it for a long time. He was not the sword of the morning anymore. That man had a name and a house and a white cloak and a legend that was now 17 years of songs that would be sung in his absence. He removed the white cloak, what remained of it, and folded it and placed it at the base of the stand. He would not burn it here. He would burn it in the mountains, where the smoke would be red as nothing. He touched the hilt of Dawn once. Not to take it. Just to remember the weight of it. Then he left the vault and closed the door behind him. They rode east before dawn, 2 riders on plain horses with a pack mule and a sleeping infant, and nothing on them that could be traced to a house or a name or a war. The red mountains swallowed them the way mountains swallow things, without acknowledgement, without ceremony. As if they had never existed to begin with. He told himself it was temporary. It did not feel temporary. The Raven arrived on a Tuesday. Maester Wallace brought it to Catelyn himself, which told her everything before she read a word, because Maesters only delivered letters personally when the letters contained things they did not want to hand to a servant. She was in the great hall nursing Robb, which was not a thing highborn ladies did themselves, but which she had decided to do anyway, because she was 17 years old, and her husband had been gone for 11 months, and she needed something to hold that needed her back. She read the letter once. Then she read it again. Very carefully. Because she was a Tully of Riverrun, and Tullys did not allow themselves to understand things they were not ready to understand, simply because the words were clear. The second reading did not change anything. Eddard Stark and 6 companions had ridden to a tower in the Red Mountains of Dorne. None of them had come back. A party sent to investigate had found 9 Northerners dead, 2 Kingsguard dead, and Lyanna Stark dead of childbed fever in the tower. No survivors. No explanation. Arthur Dayne's body was not among the dead. Robb was still nursing. He was 4 months old and had no opinions yet about any of this. Catelyn set the letter down on the table with the same deliberateness Ashara Dayne had set down a book 3 days prior and 3,000 miles away. And she looked at the far wall of the great hall for a long time, and then she said to Maester Wallace, "Send for Benjen Stark immediately, wherever he is." Benjen was at Barrowton when the Raven found him. He had been riding south with a small party after the end of his part in the war that was officially over now. Robert's War. The war that had produced a king and a ruined capital, and a question about what happened to Lyanna Stark that nobody had answered cleanly. He was 18 years old. He had fought in 2 engagements, watched men he knew die in both of them, and had been riding toward the Night's Watch for 3 weeks because the watch had seemed. In the specific way things seem to young men who are grieving and looking for somewhere to put it, like a place where the grief could be shaped into something useful. The Raven changed the direction. He rode hard for Winterfell. 5 days. He did not stop for more than the horses required. When he arrived and Catelyn told him what the letter said and handed him the letter so he could hold the words himself, he sat down on the steps of the great hall with the letter in his hands and read it, and then sat there for a while not reading it and not doing anything else either. Then he stood up and went inside. He did not take the black. Baby Robb needed a regent, and Catelyn needed, not protection exactly, she was more capable than anyone who hadn't lived with her would assume, but she needed someone who carried the Stark name in a room full of northern lords, who respected the Stark name above everything else and were going to be looking for somewhere to put their own grief very soon. Benjen was the last adult Stark male. That meant he was the regent. That meant everything else waited. He had 3 conversations with the Night's Watch in the months that followed, all with recruiters who made the journey to Winterfell with the reasonable expectation that a Stark son was still coming. He sent all 3 home politely. The calling did not go away. He simply looked at Robb's cradle every time it surfaced and let the arithmetic do the work. The northern lords came one by one through that first winter. The Umbers came first, a Greatjon 2 generations removed from the current one, wide as a barn door, who sat across the table from Benjen and said, in the direct way of Umbers, "Tell me who I'm allowed to kill." Benjen told him there was no one to kill, that the men responsible were mostly dead themselves, and that the one who wasn't had no fixed location and possibly no fixed identity anymore. The Greatjon's ancestor looked at the table for a while and then said, "That's a poor situation," and drank his ale, and that was the northern lords in general. The grief was enormous, and it had no clean target. Arthur Dayne had walked away from 9 dead northern bodies and left no forwarding address. Robert Baratheon was king and had, technically, not ordered anything that happened at the Tower. The Kingsguard had been following the commands of a dead king. The war was over. The winning side controlled everything, the northern lords. Men who understood the cold arithmetic of what you could and couldn't do based on what you had, swallowed their rage and went home and waited for it to either transform into something useful or kill them slowly from the inside. Most of them managed the former. Some did not. In Benjen's chest it went directly to hatred and stayed there, organized and quiet, the way a banked fire is quiet, present. Not extinguished, simply waiting for the moment when someone opened the damper. Arthur Dayne. The name was a small hard thing he carried everywhere. The finest swordsman in the history of the 7 kingdoms had stood in front of his brother's party and killed them all, and then had been decent enough to vanish so that the hatred had nowhere specific to point. Benjen thought about it in the mornings when he was still half asleep and the names came up before he could organize his thoughts against them. He thought about it at the training yard, correcting the form of boys who would never be within a country mile of what Arthur Dayne was, knowing that and finding it enraging in a way he couldn't entirely explain. He thought about it when Robb learned to walk, when Robb said his first word, which was not father because Robb had no reference point for that word. He filed it away and went back to governing. He was good at governing. He had not expected to be. In King's Landing, in those same months, Robert Baratheon was terrible. Jon Arryn watched it happen and managed it with the patience of a man who had spent his adult life loving difficult people and had made his peace with that particular vocation. Robert was king. Robert was also a 21-year-old man who had lost both the woman he loved and the friend who knew him best in the same week, and who had no good mechanism for processing either loss. He drank. He raged. He sat in the throne room with the iron throne cutting through his clothes and stared at the far wall. The throne always cut through clothes eventually. It was, Jon had come to believe, the most honest piece of furniture in the history of furniture. There was a child, Robert said one evening, to nobody in particular. Jon was in the room. Servants were in the room. Robert was talking in the manner of a man working something out. At that tower. The Kingsguard doesn't guard towers with 3 of their best for nothing. They were protecting something. Or someone, Jon said carefully. Was it a child? Lyanna's child? Robert looked at him. The look had a specific quality, the quality of a man who both wants and does not want the answer to the question he is asking. If she had a child before she died, if Rhaegar, we don't know what happened in that tower, Jon said. We have no witnesses. Arthur Dayne is a witness. Arthur Dayne is missing. Robert was quiet. I want him found. I know. I want to know what he knows. I understand. I've had men looking. They had. The looking produced nothing. Arthur Dayne did not want to be found, and a man who did not want to be found in the Red Mountains of Dorne could stay unfound for a long time. Eventually, the looking became less active and more ambient, the kind of ongoing attention that gets applied to problems that have no immediate solution. Jon filed it under the category of things he would return to. He had a long list in that category. Being Hand of the King was primarily the management of that list. Robert drank for 6 months with real commitment. Then he married Cersei Lannister, which solved several political problems and created several others, and the drinking became a feature rather than a response. And the grief calcified into something he carried without examining too closely. Like a man with a bad tooth who has learned which side of his mouth not to chew on. He never mentioned the Tower Child again. Not to Jon. Not to anyone. But he thought about it. Jon could see that he thought about it. In certain moments, in certain lights, when Robert went somewhere behind his eyes for a few seconds and came back a degree quieter, Jon knew. Robert was thinking about Lyanna. He was thinking about what was or wasn't left behind. Jon let him think. There were no answers to give him. And answers, in Jon's experience, were often considerably more dangerous than questions. In 289 AC, 6 years into the Regency, Balon Greyjoy raised the Kraken banner and set fire to the Lannister fleet at Lannisport. Robert called his lords to answer. Benjen left a castellan at Winterfell with Catelyn and Robb, now 6 years old and furious to be left behind, and rode south to join the royal host. The rebellion was crushed in a single season, Pike taken, the Iron Fleet broken, Balon made to kneel on the stones of his own hall. A Greyjoy boy came north to Winterfell afterward, Balon's last surviving son, to serve as ward and reminder of what rebellion cost. He was 10 years old, and had iron eyes and a way of looking at Winterfell's walls that made Benjen want to watch him carefully. He filed the feeling away and added it to the list of things requiring ongoing attention. At Winterfell, the last night of 290 AC, Benjen Stark sat in the Lord's chair in the Great Hall after everyone else had gone to sleep. It was too large for him. It had been too large for Ned. Ned had never looked entirely comfortable in it, and Ned had been born to it in a way Benjen had not. Benjen sat in it because it was the Lord's chair, and he was the acting Lord, and there was work to do that required the chair, and when the work was done he stayed in it, because there was nowhere else he needed to be. Robb's cradle was near the fire. Robb was 7 now, too old for a cradle, asleep in his own chamber upstairs. But the cradle was still there, because nobody had moved it, and Benjen had stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing things that have always been where they are. He watched the fire instead. Somewhere in the Red Mountains, or the Free Cities, or anywhere in the vast and unhelpful world, a man was alive who should not be. A man who had looked at Benjen's brother and made the calculation that ended with 9 men dead in the Dornish dust, and no explanations offered to anyone. Benjen did not know what that man was doing tonight. He did not know what that man was carrying. He did not know if the man thought about it. He watched the fire burn down. He would find out. Eventually, men who stayed alive long enough always found things out eventually. That was the one advantage time had over grief. It kept moving, regardless of whether you wanted it to. The fire burned down. Benjen stayed where he was. Outside, the north was cold and dark and enormous, and it did not offer comfort, and he had stopped expecting it to. The first thing Arthur taught the boy was how to fall. Not how to fight. Not how to hold a sword. Not how to stand. Not any of the things a boy of 7 expects to be taught when a man who moves the way Arthur moved takes him to a flat patch of red dirt in the early morning and tells him training is beginning. He taught him how to fall correctly, how to roll with the impact, how to protect the head, how to turn a momentum that was working against you into a momentum that was merely neutral. He made Jon fall for 3 days before anything else happened. Jon fell badly the first dozen times. He fell better after that. By the end of the 3rd day he was falling the way Arthur had shown him, controlled, absorbing, arriving back on his feet before the dust had time to settle. "Why do we start with falling?" Jon said. It was not quite a question. He was 7, and he had been raised by a man who answered questions carefully, and he had learned to make his questions sound like observations so they were harder to deflect. "Because everything else assumes you'll be knocked down first," Arthur said. "A man who can't fall can't fight. He's just standing up waiting." Jon thought about this. "What's the second thing?" "Tomorrow," Arthur said, and went inside. The holdfast they lived in during those years was not dramatic. It was a stone structure of 4 rooms built into the side of a ridge, accessible by a path that required someone to know it existed before they could find it, which was the point. A previous occupant had grown something in the walled yard behind it. The dried stalks of whatever it had been were still there in the first year, and Arthur cleared them, and by the 2nd year Jon had begun using the cleared space before Arthur was awake. Arthur noticed this approximately the 3rd morning it happened. He said nothing about it for 2 weeks. He watched from the doorway with a cup of water, and watched the boy run the footwork drills he had been shown the previous day, repeating them with the specific stubbornness of someone who has decided that competence is the goal, and is prepared to be inconvenienced by the distance between current ability and that goal. He went back inside and said nothing. This was, in its way, the most important thing he ever taught Jon Snow, and he never taught it directly. At 11, in a village 2 hours' ride from the holdfast, Jon fought 3 boys at once. They were older, 13, 14, one of them 15, sons of sellswords wintering in the village, looking for the kind of entertainment that requires a smaller target and a reasonable expectation of impunity. Jon was small for 11, dark-haired, quiet in the manner that reads as an invitation to certain people. He was not carrying a weapon, because Arthur had been specific about when weapons were appropriate in populated areas, and Jon had found that following Arthur's specific instructions was efficient in a way that ignoring them was not. He lasted 37 seconds against the 3 of them with his hands. Arthur, who had followed at a distance as a matter of practice, counted. The 3 boys were not seriously hurt. Jon had 2 split knuckles and a swelling below his left eye when he came back to where Arthur was standing. "How long?" Jon said. 37 seconds. Jon nodded, working the knuckles of his right hand. "I made a mistake with my feet at about 20. I gave up the angle to the left." "Yes. If I had kept it I could have used the wall." "Yes. How long should I have lasted?" Arthur looked at him for a moment. "Tomorrow you last 42. Jon's jaw tightened in the way it did when he was recalculating something. "That's only 5 more seconds. 5 more seconds against 3 opponents who outweigh you is not 5 seconds. It's a different fight." They rode back to the holdfast without speaking further. Arthur did not compliment him. He did not need to. Jon had not been looking for a compliment. He had been conducting an inventory of what had gone wrong and what could be adjusted, and compliments would have interrupted that process. The histories of Westeros entered the curriculum at 8. Not as stories, Arthur had no use for history as entertainment. He taught it the way a siege commander teaches terrain, as a set of permanent facts about what people do when their interests conflict with their principles, which is always, and how the results of those moments compound over generations into the conditions a man inherits when he arrives. Jon learned every major house. He learned their words and their words behind their words. He learned the Lannister habit of purchasing loyalty with coin, and the Stark habit of purchasing it with character, and he learned that the Lannister method had a longer shelf life in peacetime and a significantly shorter one when the crisis was existential. He learned about the Night's Watch without knowing he had a personal relationship to it. He learned about Dorne in the Reach and the particular psychology of the Iron Islands, men who had built an entire culture around a scarcity that their culture was itself causing, which Arthur pointed out as an example of the kind of circular thinking that ends kingdoms. He learned High Valyrian because Arthur told him to learn it. He did not know why until later, and when he asked, Arthur said only, because certain doors open from one side only, and it's better to have the key before you need the door. Jon filed this response under the category of Arthur's answers that would eventually make complete sense, and moved on. At 13, Jon began sparring with Arthur directly. Real sparring, full speed, with practice blades that were weighted to match the steel they were meant to approximate. The first session lasted 4 minutes before Arthur had Jon's blade out of his hands and the tip of his own at Jon's sternum. He was not breathing hard. Jon was. Again, Arthur said, and reset his stance, and waited. By the end of the first month, sessions lasted between 6 and 12 minutes depending on the day. Jon's improvement was not the smooth upward line of a teaching story. It came in bursts, 3 days of marginal progress, then one morning when something had apparently reorganized itself overnight in the architecture of his understanding, and he moved differently. Arthur recognized the pattern. He had seen it before, in his own training, in the training of others. He did not comment on the burst days, because commenting would make Jon conscious of them, and consciousness of the mechanism tended to interrupt it. In the 8th month, on a Tuesday morning with the light coming flat off the ridge, Arthur moved to end an exchange with a rotation he had used successfully 40 times in their sessions. Jon did not parry it. He stepped inside it, inside the arc, inside the reach, to the space where the blade had no leverage, and the hand that held it was briefly committed to a direction it could not escape. And pushed. Arthur took 2 steps backward. It was the first time in 41 years of training that a student had forced him to move reactively. Not much. 2 steps. It did not matter how much. That night, Arthur trained alone for 2 hours after Jon had gone to sleep. Not because he was concerned about the gap closing. He was. That was honest. But because a student who had stopped being predictable required a teacher to be more precise, and precision required work, and he would not shortchange the work. He did not know that Jon watched from the shadow of the doorway for 20 minutes before going back to bed. What Arthur did not allow himself to examine for the first several years was the specific category of concern he felt on the 3 occasions when Jon was seriously ill. Not hurt in training. Hurt happened constantly and was managed without sentiment, but sick. A chest infection at 9, a fever at 11, a badly infected cut at 13 that went 3 days without showing improvement before finally responding. The chest infection was the one. Jon was 9 years old and coughing through the night with a sound that had a depth to it that Arthur did not like, and Arthur sat outside Jon's room in the dark with his back against the wall for the entire night, because he was not going to sleep anyway, and being closer to the door seemed marginally better than being farther from it. He told himself this was rational. It was an investment of 16 years. It was the oath. It was the last command of his dead prince and the last breath of a dying woman, made into a vow that he had organized his entire subsequent existence around fulfilling. Of course he was not going to sleep when the investment was coughing. He believed this for approximately 2 more years before he stopped believing it. At 11, when the fever broke after 3 days and Jon came to the doorway pale and thin and irritated to have lost 3 training days, Arthur looked at him and understood with complete clarity that he had been lying to himself for a long time about the nature of what he felt, and that the truth was simpler and more inconvenient than any version he had constructed. He loved the boy like a son. This did not make him soft. It made everything he did more precise. Soft was sentiment without purpose. What he felt now had enormous purpose. It sharpened every correction, every drill, every morning session, every night spent reviewing what had not been right yet and what would need to be. At 14, on a morning in late autumn with the cold finally arriving in the mountains, Jon pressed him. Not forced 2 steps. Pressed him for 12 full exchanges, attacking with combinations Arthur had not programmed into any session, reading the responses and adjusting mid-sequence with a fluency that should not have existed in a 14-year-old body, and did. Arthur's footwork was perfect, his responses were perfect, but they were responses, not initiations, and the distinction mattered. Arthur called a stop. He stood and looked at the boy across 8 feet of packed dirt. Jon was breathing hard. Arthur was not, quite. The sweat on both of them caught the early light. Arthur studied him for a long time. Jon met his eyes and waited, which was the correct choice. "You're not a student anymore," Arthur said. "You're a problem I have to solve." Jon said nothing for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved in a way that it had never moved before in 14 years. Not a smile exactly. The shape of one. The outline where a smile would be if he let it fully arrive. Arthur turned and went inside to start the morning meal. Jon was 16 when Arthur sat him down and told him the truth, and the first thing he said when Arthur finished was nothing. Because he did not trust what would come out. He sat across the table with his hands flat on the wood and looked at Arthur's face and worked through the inventory of what he had just been told the same way he worked through everything, methodically, refusing to skip steps, beginning at the beginning. His mother was Lyanna Stark of Winterfell. His father was Rhaegar Targaryen, crown prince of the Seven Kingdoms, killed at the Trident by Robert Baratheon's hammer before Jon was 3 months old. The marriage had been real, witnessed, registered, documented by a high septon whose records had not been destroyed because nobody had known to destroy them. His name was Aegon Targaryen, 6th of his name. The throne that Robert Baratheon had held for 16 years belonged, by every law of succession that Westeros recognized when it suited itself, to the boy sitting at this table with his hands flat on the wood. He sat with it for a long time. Arthur did not fill the silence. He had the patience of someone who had spent 16 years waiting and understood that some processes could not be hurried without being broken. "You've known this since the Tower," Jon said finally. "Yes, since the day I was born." "Yes, and you decided," Jon stopped, "organized it. You decided that 16 years was the appropriate amount of time to wait before mentioning it." "I decided," Arthur said, "that you needed to be capable before you needed to be informed. The information without the capability would have been a death sentence. The capability without the information was a lie." Arthur did not flinch from it. "Yes," Jon stood up. He walked to the far wall of the room and stood with his back to Arthur and looked at the stone, which offered nothing. His hands, he noticed, were not shaking. He was not sure what to do with that. He felt like his hands should be shaking. His mother was Lyanna Stark. He had a face he had never seen. He had a name he had never used. He had a claim to a throne held by a man who had started a war over his mother's choices, and who believed the infant from that tower did not exist, and who had been sitting comfortably in his error for 16 years, while the actual heir learned how to fall correctly in the red dust of Dorne. "I had a name," Jon said to the wall. "I had a real name, and you called me Jon. Your mother named you Aegon. I called you Jon to keep you alive. Those are not in conflict. They are from where I'm standing." Arthur said nothing. Jon turned around. "I want to know about her. My mother. Not the political version, not the version that explains the marriage and the legitimacy and the claim. I want to know what she was like." Arthur was quiet for a moment. "I did not know her well. I was Kingsguard. I kept distance as a rule. But I saw her at Harrenhal, before any of it. She was—" He paused with the specific quality of someone selecting the right word rather than the available one. "She was not manageable. That is the best I can say. She had opinions about everything and the stubbornness to defend them past the point where most people give in. Rhaegar was drawn to it. People who are very controlled are sometimes drawn to people who are not. Did she want to go with him? Yes, everyone says she was taken. Everyone who says that did not speak to her. Robert Baratheon went to war over a story. The story served him. He kept it. Jon absorbed this. And my father. Rhaegar was the most gifted man I served. I say that as a sober assessment, not sentiment. He was a better strategist than anyone in his council, a better swordsman than anyone except me, a better musician than anyone I have heard before or since. He was also capable of making decisions of enormous consequence without fully accounting for the consequences, because he believed that the importance of the goal justified the cost. Sometimes he was right. Sometimes Arthur looked at the table, Sometimes people who weren't him paid the cost. People like Elia Martell. Yes, people like Ned Stark. Arthur raised his eyes. Jon was watching him with the specific quality of attention that Arthur had spent 7 years developing in him. Complete, flat, waiting, giving nothing away in advance. Eddard Stark rode to that tower to rescue his sister, Arthur said. He brought 6 men. He was brave and capable, and he came in good faith. I killed him because he was in front of me, and I was doing my duty, and those are the only true reasons. Jon stood very still. Was he a good man? He was one of the best men I ever faced. The room held that for a while. Then I owe him something, Jon said. I owe the North something. He said it quietly, not as a declaration, as a conclusion reached by following the logic to where it led. They lost him because of what I am. They'd been carrying that for 16 years without knowing why. That's a debt. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. I need 3 days, he said. Don't follow me. He left. Arthur listened to his footsteps descend and then move away across the yard until the sound was gone. And then, he sat alone in the room with the morning light moving across the table and the weight of a 16-year-old secret that had just transferred from one set of shoulders to another. He did not follow him. Jon came back on the 3rd morning before dawn. He came back the way he came back from everything, without preamble, without announcing the return. Simply present again where he had not been. He sat down across from Arthur and put his hands on the table in the same position he had used 3 days prior, and he looked at Arthur with eyes that were older than they had been before the conversation. Not harder. Older. Which is different. You kept this secret to protect me, Jon said. But you also kept it because you weren't sure I was ready. Yes, are you sure now? Arthur thought about it. He gave it the consideration it deserved, which meant he did not answer immediately. He thought about the boy at 7, learning to fall. He thought about 11 and 37 seconds against 3 opponents. He thought about 13, and the cut that had gone bad, and the 3 days he'd spent not examining too closely what he felt when the fever finally broke. He thought about 14 and 2 steps backward in the red dust, and all the mornings since, and the 16-year gap between the oath he had sworn to a dying woman and this specific morning with the light just starting to come through the window. No, Arthur said. But I was never going to be sure. The realm is rotting. I can smell it from here. Jon Arryn is dead. I've had word from a reliable source these past months. Robert is without a hand he trusts. The Lannisters are positioned everywhere. Every month we wait, the rot goes deeper, and the correction becomes more expensive. He looked at Jon directly. It is time. Jon nodded once. The nod of a man who had already reached the same conclusion from a different direction and was confirming that the 2 paths ended at the same place. Then I need to know everything else, Jon said. Everything you haven't told me. Every alliance, every enemy, every political reality that I've been learning in theory and need to understand as fact. If we're going to Westeros, I need to go as something more than a swordsman with a good bloodline. We'll spend a month on it. Properly, and Westeros first or King's Landing first? The North first. Always the North first. Arthur said it without hesitation. Because before Robert knows you exist, the North should. Because the North's grief is the North's power. And you are the answer to a question they have been asking for 16 years. And if they understand that before anyone else does, you arrive in King's Landing with the weight of it already behind you. Jon was quiet for a moment, thinking it through, running the angles the way Arthur had taught him to run the angles. Benjen Stark, he said. Yes, he hates you. Yes, and he'll look at me and... Jon paused. He'll see his brother. Won't he? Arthur did not answer, because the answer was not the kind that needed stating. He went to the Holdfast's back room that afternoon, the one with the locked chest that Jon had noticed at 7, and asked about at 9, and stopped asking about sometime around 12, when it became clear that the answer would arrive when it arrived. He opened it. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had been replaced twice in 16 years, was Dawn. He unwrapped it on the table. The milk glass blade caught the afternoon light and held it the way it always held it, with that faint inner luminescence that had no clean explanation and required none. The edge was perfect. He had maintained it throughout the exile years, not because he intended to use it, but because some habits were structural, and letting the blade go to ruin would have been letting something in himself go to ruin by proxy. 16 years. He had been no one for 16 years, and the sword had been in a chest, and the boy had become something that did not have a clean historical parallel. And all of it had been leading to this specific afternoon, with the light through the window and the blade on the table. He picked it up. The weight was exactly as he remembered. It was always exactly as he remembered. Jon appeared in the doorway. He looked at Dawn for a long moment without speaking. Arthur crossed the room and held it out. Jon took it. He held it the way someone holds a thing they are assessing rather than claiming, both hands weight distributed, turning it slightly to feel the balance. He was silent for 10 seconds. Then, he turned it back and extended it toward Arthur. "That's yours," Jon said. "The sword of the morning. Not mine. Mine is still waiting for me." Arthur took it. He looked at Jon's face and found nothing there that required a response, which was the correct amount. They began to pack for Westeros before the sun went down. They came off the ship at White Harbor on a gray morning with the smell of fish and salt and the particular cold of the north that is different from the cold of the mountains, wetter, deeper. The kind that gets into the joints rather than the skin. Jon stood on the dock and looked at the city and said nothing for a moment. He had never been north of Dorne. He had never seen snow. There was no snow yet. It was too early in the season. But the sky had the specific flat white quality of a sky that was thinking about it. The city around them was stone and timber and northern practicality, no ornamentation that wasn't structural, no gestures toward beauty that hadn't first justified themselves as utility. It looked like a place built by people who had decided that survival was enough of an ambition without adding vanity to the list. "It's colder than I expected," Jon said. "It gets worse," Arthur said. They bought horses and rode north. Arthur had considered every approach and discarded most of them. The direct route to King's Landing was wrong for reasons he had already named, and Jon had already understood. Going to a major lord first, the Umbers, the Karstarks, the Manderleys, was wrong because major lords talked, and the first conversation that needed to happen was not one that could afford an audience. Going to Winterfell itself was wrong, because Catelyn Tully Stark was there, and Catelyn was Tully before she was anything else. And Tullis ran toward political alliance with an instinct that bypassed deliberation. Benjen was right for the same reasons the others were wrong. He was a Stark. He had no political allegiances beyond the north. He carried 16 years of a very specific grief with nowhere to put it, and grief, properly addressed, converted into something more useful than grief. And he was the one person alive who had known Ned Stark well enough to look at Jon's face and understand it without being told. The road from White Harbor to the area south of Winterfell took 3 days. They rode without banners, without identifying anything. 2 travelers in plain wool moving north, on a road that was not heavily trafficked in this season. Nobody looked at them twice. Arthur had been nobody for 16 years. He was good at it. On the second night, Jon asked the question he had been not asking since they left the holdfast. "When he sees you," Jon said, "what do you expect him to do?" "Try to kill me, probably. He's been regent for 16 years. He's had a long time to think about the conversation he wanted to have with me. And you're confident he won't. I'm confident he'll be looking at you by the time the instinct fully arrives." Jon was quiet for a while. "Because I look like Ned Stark. Because you look like Ned Stark." It was not a comfortable thing to be. Jon had understood that since Chapter 5, since the moment Arthur told him whose face he carried. He was the living consequence of a dead man who had ridden with honor toward a tower in the mountains and not come back. Every northern lord who had loved Ned Stark would see it. It was not a disguise or an advantage in any conventional sense. It was simply true, and the truth of it would do what truths did, arrive before any argument could be constructed against it. They found Benjen Stark 20 miles south of Winterfell, which was not where they had expected to find him. He was on the road with a small party of 4 riders, returning from an inspection of the Southwest holdings. He was lean and weathered, and looked approximately 10 years older than his age suggested he should, which was what 16 years of regency did to a man who had expected to spend that time on the wall. He wore a dire wolf clasp on his riding cloak. His hand went to his sword before he had consciously identified what he was looking at. Then, he identified what he was looking at. He sat very still on his horse, his hand stayed on the sword hilt. His face did the thing faces do when the mind is receiving information it is not prepared to process in real time and is buying itself time by not changing expression. "You're dead," Benjen said. His voice was level in the way voices are level when the speaker has decided that level is the only acceptable option and is enforcing it by will. "No," Arthur said. "You were dead. You, the tower. They found 9 northern bodies and 2 Kingsguard and my brothers." He stopped. His jaw worked. "Where is your body, Dayne? Everyone looked for your body." "I know. I made sure they wouldn't find it." Benjen's eyes moved to Jon. They moved there the way eyes move to fire, not deliberately, but because something in the visual system recognizes something significant and pulls attention toward it without asking for consent. He looked at Jon's face and went very still in a new way, a different quality of stillness from the controlled stillness of a moment before. Jon met his eyes and waited. Benjen's hand came off the sword hilt. Slowly, without apparent decision, the way water finds its own level. "Gods," Benjen said quietly. "Gods." He was not speaking to either of them. He was speaking to whatever witnesses he believed in, because a man looks at a face that is not the face he is expecting in a dead man's place, and there is nothing else to say. Jon said, "My name is Aegon Targaryen. My mother was Lyanna Stark. I am told I carry her face, and yours." Benjen got off his horse. He did not announce that he was doing it. He simply dismounted and sat down on a large flat stone at the side of the road and put his elbows on his knees and looked at the ground for a long time. Behind him, his 4 riders exchanged looks and said nothing, because whatever was happening was clearly not something their presence was designed to address. Arthur also dismounted. He did not approach Benjen. He stood at a distance that was respectful in the specific way distance is respectful when someone needs to process something, and physical proximity would be an intrusion. Jon stayed where he was. The road was quiet. A bird somewhere. The sound of horses breathing. The flat gray sky doing nothing in particular. "Tell me," Benjen said finally, to the ground. "All of it, from the beginning." Arthur told him. He told it plainly, in sequence without softening anything. The duel. Howland Reed's blade and the half-second that unmade everything. Ned's death, not elaborated, not abbreviated, stated as the fact it was and what it had cost. Lyanna's last hour. The vow. Starfall and Ashara and the staged death and the chest and the 16 years in the mountains, making a boy into something adequate to the weight he was inheriting. Benjen listened without speaking. His 4 riders had quietly moved their horses further down the road, a tactful withdrawal that suggested at least one of them had good instincts. When Arthur finished, Benjen sat with it for a while. He picked up a small stone from the road and turned it over in his hands without looking at it. He never knew, Benjen said. Ned, he never knew whose child he was riding to find. He knew Lyanna had a child. He did not know the rest. He died not knowing the rest. Yes, Benjen threw the stone into the grass at the side of the road. The gesture had no particular force behind it. He would have protected the boy anyway. If he'd known, he would have kept the same secret. He stopped. That's exactly the thing he would have done. Nobody said anything for a moment. "I don't forgive you," Benjen said to Arthur. His voice was still level. It was a different kind of level now, not enforced, just arrived at. The way a man sounds when he has made a decision by following the logic, and the logic has delivered him somewhere he did not choose, but can accept. "Maybe I never will. But I understand you. There's a difference." Arthur said, "I know." Benjen finally looked at Jon. Really looked, not the overwhelmed glance of recognition from the road, but the deliberate look of a man deciding who someone is rather than simply what they resemble. He looked for a long time. Jon held it without adjusting his expression, which was the correct choice. "You ride like a Dane," Benjen said. "I was taught by one." Benjen almost smiled. The almost was enough. "Come," he said. We're 20 miles out. There's a farmstead we use. We'll talk properly inside, somewhere without a road. They rode through the afternoon. Benjen asked questions the whole way. Not hostile questions, working ones, the questions of a man who has managed a complicated situation for 16 years and is now assessing how a new variable interacts with the existing structure. He asked about the timeline. He asked about the evidence, the marriage document, the Septon's records. He asked about Ashara. When Arthur told him Ashara was alive somewhere in the Free Cities, Benjen was quiet for a long time before he said, "That's good. She should know it ended the right way." At the farmstead by a fire, Benjen told them what Winterfell looked like now. Robb was 16, broad in the shoulders, beginning to assert himself in the way young lords do when the work of being a lord becomes real to them rather than theoretical. He was serious and capable and had his father's manner with people, the kind of manner that made men want to follow without being entirely sure why. He had not been told yet. Benjen had decided in the first hour that Robb needed to be told before anyone else in Winterfell, and that the telling needed to happen right. "He'll have questions," Benjen said. "He should," Jon said. "He might not," Benjen looked at him. "He might not know what to feel. He grew up as the Lord of Winterfell. He's been preparing for it his whole life. And now there's a cousin who has a claim that—" "I'm not here for Winterfell," Jon said. "I have no claim on Winterfell. That's Robb's. That will always be Robb's." Benjen studied him. "You're sure of that?" "I'm completely sure of that." Benjen nodded once, slowly, satisfied by something in the way it was said. They arrived at Winterfell the following morning. Benjen had sent a rider ahead, not with explanation, but with enough to prepare for guests. The castle received them without ceremony in the side yard, which was Benjen's intention. Robb Stark was in the yard when they rode in. 16 years old, built like his father would have been at that age, red-brown hair, the Tully blue eyes that had skipped Jon entirely. He watched them dismount with the careful attention of a young man who has been told something is significant without being told what. He looked at Jon. The yard was quiet. Benjen's riders had moved off. Arthur stood slightly behind Jon, which was where he always stood. Robb looked at Jon's face for a long moment. He was too young to have seen Ned Stark at 16. But he had grown up with Ned's face above him at every meal, behind every lesson, in the memory of every man in the north who had served under him or ridden with him, or simply known him as the thing a northern lord was supposed to be. "You look like my father," Robb said. "I know," Jon said. "I'm sorry." Robb shook his head. "Don't be." He looked at Jon for another moment, with eyes that were working through something too complicated to finish in a single glance. "He'd have liked you." The yard stayed quiet. Somewhere above them a crow called once and went silent. The city smelled of people. Jon had known villages and one mid-sized free city's port, and the particular human smell of sellsword encampments in summer. But nothing had prepared him for the specific density of King's Landing, a place that had been built for perhaps half the number of people currently living in it, and which had responded to the overcrowding not by expanding but by compressing, every street narrower than it needed to be. Every building taller than was structurally advisable. The whole of it producing a smell that was the combined output of 200,000 lives in close proximity without adequate drainage. "It's enormous," Jon said. "It's a problem," Arthur said, which was not a disagreement. They had come with Benjen's small escort, 8 riders, northern, wearing no livery. It was enough to signal that they were not nobody without signaling anything specific. Jon rode in the middle of the group, which Arthur had suggested and Jon had not argued with. The city gates had admitted them without incident. The city itself was another matter. The crowd on the Street of Steel thinned in front of them before Jon understood why. Then he saw the gold cloaks at the far end of the block, and behind the gold cloaks, white. The escort was 20 Lannister men arranged across the width of the street with the practiced geometry of soldiers who had been told where to stand and had done so. In front of the soldiers, alone, not 20 feet ahead of the line, was Jaime Lannister. He was exactly what the songs described, which was unusual in Jon's experience. Most things the songs described were adjacent to the truth at best. Jaime Lannister was genuinely that: the golden hair, the ease of stance, the quality of stillness that a man achieves when he is so certain of his own capability that waiting for a confrontation produces no anxiety whatsoever. He wore Kingsguard white, with Lannister gold at the trim, which was not standard and was a deliberate signal, and he wore it the way men wear things when they have never had reason to be self-conscious about anything they put on. He was looking directly at Arthur. Arthur brought his horse to a stop. The group stopped with him. The street between them was perhaps 30 yards of packed dirt and the particular silence of a crowd that has moved to the edges of something. "I thought you were dead," Jaime said. His tone was conversational, genuinely curious, the tone of a man who has received unexpected news and finds it more interesting than alarming. The songs were very specific about it. "Songs are often specific about things they weren't present for," Arthur said. "True." Jaime glanced at Jon. The glance was brief, but complete. He was a professional, and professionals conducted their assessments without announcing them. "The boy is the claim. The boy is the king." Jaime smiled. It was not a mocking smile exactly. It was the smile of a man who finds the world consistently more entertaining than it has any right to be. "Cersei would like you to stop here. I imagine she would. She'd like it quite a lot, actually, enough to send me, which tells you something about how much she'd like it." "It tells me she's frightened," Arthur said. "Which tells me she has something to protect that she doesn't believe can survive examination." The smile stayed on Jaime's face, but something shifted behind it. He looked at Arthur for a moment with an expression that was calculating in the specific way of a man who has spent 30 years measuring everyone he meets against an internal standard, and is now taking a measurement he did not expect to be conducting today. "Half the blade work in the Seven Kingdoms traces back to you at some remove," Jaime said. "Men who watched you fight. Men who learned from those men. The lineage runs everywhere if you follow it long enough. You're in the footwork of every serious swordsman in this city, apparently. Then you already know how this ends. I know how it ends if you're what they say you were." Jaime straightened slightly, a preparatory adjustment so natural it barely registered as movement. 16 years is a long time. Men slow down. "Come and find out," Arthur said. Jaime drew his sword. He was fast. Jon noted this with the part of his mind that had been trained for 7 years to observe before engaging. Jaime was genuinely, remarkably fast, the sword clearing the scabbard and arriving in guard position in a single motion that had no wasted component. He moved into the space between them with the confidence of a man who had done this against every serious opponent the Seven Kingdoms had produced over the past decade, and had not yet encountered a ceiling. Arthur dismounted. He did this unhurriedly, handing his reins to the rider beside him, and met Jaime on the street with his sword already drawn, which he had drawn before Jaime finished his sentence about slowing down. They came together in the middle of the street, and Jon watched from horseback and understood something in the first 3 exchanges that the crowd watching from the edges of the street would not understand until it was over. Jaime was pressing. He opened with 3 aggressive combinations, fast, varied, well-constructed. The kind of attack sequence designed to find weaknesses in a defensive structure by throwing different problems at it in quick succession. It was the right approach against an unknown opponent. The logic was sound. Arthur was not defending. He was letting Jaime press, which looked like defense, but was not. He was absorbing the angles, reading the weight transfers, cataloging the tells. The slight drop of Jaime's left shoulder before a diagonal cut, the way his footwork shortened when he was setting up a thrust. He was doing what he had always done, which was conduct the fight in his head 2 exchanges ahead of the fight happening in the street, and what was happening in the street was simply the confirmation of what he had already seen. At the 17th exchange, Arthur changed. Not dramatically. The shift was visible only if you knew what you were looking at, which Jon did. Arthur stopped absorbing and started directing, began placing Jaime's blade where he wanted it, rather than responding to where it arrived. Jaime was too good not to feel it. His footwork adjusted, tightened. A half-second acceleration that told Jon he had registered the shift and was trying to get ahead of it. He did not get ahead of it. At the 23rd exchange, Arthur's blade found the crossguard of Jaime's sword at an angle that had no defense except releasing the grip, and Jaime's sword left his hand and turned twice in the air and hit the street dirt 4 feet to his left. The street of steel was completely quiet. Jaime stood with his empty sword hand still in position, the muscle memory of the grip persisting after the sword was gone. He looked at his hand. He looked at Arthur. He looked at his sword in the dirt. Nobody in the crowd moved. Arthur had not moved either. He stood at his finishing distance, sword at his side, breathing in a way that a man breathes when he has been walking at a moderate pace, not winded, not theatrical about not being winded, simply present. Jaime walked to his sword. He bent and picked it up. He stood with it for a moment. Then he slid it back into the scabbard with a small, definitive sound. He looked at Arthur for a long time. The calculation in his expression had changed quality. It was no longer the calculation of a man measuring an opponent. It was the calculation of a man revising a foundational assumption about the world. "You're real," Jaime said. "I was always real," Arthur said. "You were just never in a room with me." Jaime was quiet. Something moved through his expression that was too complicated to name and too honest to dismiss. He was the Kingslayer. He had murdered the man he swore to protect because the man was going to burn a city full of people, and he had never been thanked for it, and he had carried that in the specific way of men who do a necessary thing and are despised for it. And it had made him armored and caustic and brilliant and a little careless about everything except swordsmanship, which was the one place he was still entirely serious. And now the one place he was still entirely serious had just been sorted efficiently and without animosity by a man who had apparently been in the mountains for 16 years, not slowing down. He looked at Jon. The look was brief and direct and without hostility. Jon met it. "The North is behind him?" Jaime asked Arthur, without looking away from Jon. "The North is behind him." Jaime stepped aside. He moved to the edge of the street in 2 unhurried steps and stood there with his hands at his sides and his face, doing something complicated and private. The Lannister soldiers looked at each other and then at Jaime, and then moved aside in a ragged sequence that began on the left and completed on the right, opening the street the way a door opens, slowly, then fully. Jon rode forward. Arthur fell in beside him. Benjen's escort followed in silence. As they passed Jaime, Jon looked at him. He looked at him the way Arthur had taught him to look at people, completely, without announcing it. Jaime was looking at the middle distance and did not return it. They came through onto the broader avenue leading toward the Red Keep. The city opened up around them. The smells and the noise and the impossible scale of a place that had housed dynasties and burned them and housed more. Jon looked up. The Red Keep sat at the top of Aegon's Hill the way it always had, the way it had for 150 years, the way it had when the dynasty whose blood ran in Jon's veins built it from the bones of a continent they had just finished conquering. Redstone. Towers, the city below it and the sky above it, and everything between them belonging, technically, to the boy looking up at it from a horse on a street that smelled of iron and too many people. "Last time you were here," Jon said to Arthur, "what was happening?" Arthur looked up at the Red Keep. He was quiet for a moment. A king was burning himself alive in the throne room, and a good man was deciding to stop him. And now? Arthur looked at him. And now, a better question is being asked. They rode toward the gates of the Red Keep. The city watched them pass the way cities watch things they have not yet decided how to feel about, from the corners of its eyes, waiting to see what the thing did next, before committing to a position. The throne room had been Robert's idea, then Jon Arryn's veto, then a compromise that landed on the small council chamber because it was large enough for the principals and small enough to manage. Robert had been king for 16 years and had developed over that time an instinct for the difference between settings that amplified situations and settings that contained them. The throne room amplified everything, the acoustics, the Iron Throne itself cutting the dais like a bad joke about power, the 100 feet of open floor that turned every entrance into a statement. The small council chamber was a room where things got decided. He wanted this decided, not performed. He was standing when they brought them in. He had meant to be sitting, but he had stood up when the door opened and the standing had happened before the decision to stand, which told him something about what was happening in his chest that he chose not to examine. Arthur Dayne walked through the door first. Robert had imagined this moment for 16 years. He had imagined it with violence. He had imagined it with specific violence, the particular kind that gets very detailed in the middle of sleepless nights, when the wine isn't working and the grief has nowhere to go. He had imagined Arthur Dayne's face, and had placed things on it, explanations, apologies, the kind of reckoning that grief invents when it cannot find the real thing. The face that walked through the door was older than the one he had imagined, harder, a man who had been living rather than a man who had been frozen at the point of maximum grievance. That was the first thing Robert had not accounted for. The second thing was the boy. Jon Snow walked in behind Arthur, and Robert looked at him, and his prepared inventory of feelings shifted without his permission. The boy had dark hair and gray eyes, and the bone structure of the Stark family rendered so clearly that it was less a resemblance than a direct quotation. He looked like Ned Stark at an age that Ned Stark had been before Robert knew him. He looked like the North distilled to a face. He also, Robert would understand later, looked like something else, something in the jaw, the set of the shoulders, a quality of stillness that was not Stark and was not quite identifiable unless you had spent a considerable amount of time looking at the way a particular dynasty held itself in old paintings on old walls. Benjen Stark came in behind them both. Robert looked at Benjen. Benjen met his eyes and gave him a single nod that was not deferential. It was the nod of a man, confirming a fact. The council chamber had the Lannister faction arranged on one side, Cersei, two of her advisors, Joffrey standing at his mother's shoulder with the expression of a boy who has been told he is important and has no mechanism yet for distinguishing importance from danger. Tywin Lannister was not present, being at Casterly Rock, which was either fortunate or a problem to be addressed later. Barristan Selmy stood at the wall, which was where he always stood, wearing the expression of a man who is committed to remaining neutral until the situation clarifies itself. Robert looked at Arthur. "You have something to say," Robert said. "Say it." Arthur said it without theater. He had the documents produced first. A maester was called, the records brought. The registry of High Septon Maynard opened to the relevant page and placed on the table where anyone who wanted to could read it. A ceremony witnessed, 2 signatories, a date in the year 281 AC, 3 months before Harrenhal. Before any of it, before the war, before the rebellion, before any story Robert had been telling himself about why things happened the way they did. He then gave his own testimony, not as a narrative, as a sworn accounting, stated in the flat, precise manner of a man who has organized his facts in advance and is presenting them in the sequence most resistant to objection. Lyanna had gone willingly. The marriage was real. The child was legitimate. The child was 16 years old and standing in this room, and his name was Aegon Targaryen. 6th of his name. Cersei interrupted twice. The second time, Robert held up one hand without looking at her, and she stopped, which told Jon something about the specific register of Robert's authority when he chose to use it. Benjen spoke last. He stood and gave his name and his relationship to Ned Stark, and said plainly that the boy's face was explanation enough for him, and that if the council required further justification for what a Stark face on a Targaryen heir implied about the reliability of Arthur Dayne's account, he was prepared to stand there until they worked it out. The chamber was quiet when he finished. Robert had not moved from where he was standing. He was looking at the documents on the table without reading them. He was doing the thing Robert did when he was processing rather than performing, going somewhere interior, the place behind his eyes that nobody else had access to, the place that was still the boy from the Eyrie who had loved 2 people absolutely and lost them both in the same week. Did he know? Robert said. The question arrived without announcement, interrupting nothing because there was nothing to interrupt. He looked at Arthur. Ned, did he know what was in that tower when he rode there? He knew Lyanna had a child, Arthur said. He did not know the rest. Robert absorbed this. He rode to that tower not knowing whose child it was. Yes, and you. Robert stopped. His jaw worked briefly. You were in his way. Yes, Robert was quiet for a long time. Jon watched him. Watched the grief move through him the way weather moves through a landscape, not stopping anywhere, not resolving into anything, just passing over everything and leaving it changed in ways that wouldn't be visible until later. Robert was a big man, and grief made big men strange to watch, because the scale of it was wrong. because something that large moving visibly through a chest that large produced a dissonance that the eye didn't know what to do with. "Get the Lannisters out of this room," Robert said. Cersei drew breath for an objection. "Out," Robert said. The word had a quality that the previous sentence had not louder, simply final, the tone of a man who will not be revisited on this particular decision. Cersei left with the specific controlled fury of a woman who is calculating her next position while executing her current retreat. Joffrey followed. The advisors followed. The door closed. Barristan Selmy remained at the wall. Robert looked at him. Barristan looked back. "Stay," Robert said. Barristan nodded once and stayed. The room held Robert, Jon, Arthur, Benjen, Barristan, and the documents on the table. Robert finally sat down. He put both hands flat on the table, a gesture that was somehow an echo of Jon doing the same thing 3 days prior in a holdfast, which neither of them would ever know, and he looked at Jon with the specific attention of a man who has stopped managing what he looks like and is simply looking. "How old are you?" Robert said. 16, Jon said. "Ned was 20 when I first met him. You look like him at 20. How is that?" He stopped. Shook his head. "Never mind." He looked at the documents. "The High Septon's registry. Maynard, he's been dead 8 years. Convenient, the record predates his death by 18 years, Arthur said. "I know. I'm not accusing you of forgery. I'm noting that the one man who could confirm it independently is dead." He looked at Jon again. "Your claim supersedes Viserys. You know that." "Yes, Viserys is somewhere in the Free Cities, him and his sister, eating Illyrio Mopatis's charity and drinking his wine and telling anyone who'll listen that he's the rightful king. There are now 3 of you." "Viserys's claim is through the male line from Aerys," Jon said. "Mine is through Rhaegar, who was heir before Aerys died. Which makes my claim senior." Robert looked at him with something that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. "You've thought about this. I've had 16 years of preparation and a very thorough teacher." Robert leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, in the manner of a man who is looking at the ceiling, because looking at the ceiling is easier than looking at the things he's actually thinking about. "You want the throne," he said. "I want the North to stop grieving my uncle," Jon said. "I want the realm to remember that there was a king before you worth remembering. And I want to stand trial for my claim in the proper manner, so no one can ever say it was handed to me." The room was quiet. Robert brought his eyes down from the ceiling and looked at Jon for a long time. He looked at him the way he had looked at things he was deciding about for 16 years, not quickly, not generously, but honestly, with the part of himself that had not been entirely consumed by the drinking and the hunting and the slow erosion of being a man who had won something he had not known how to keep. Something moved in his expression, not softening exactly. Recognition. The specific recognition of a man who has heard a sentence that sounds like another man he used to know. Ned would have said something exactly like that, Robert said. He said it quietly, to nobody in particular, the way a man says something that arrives from somewhere deeper than the conversation he is currently having. He looked at the table after he said it. He picked up the edge of the document and set it back down. Jon said nothing. Arthur said nothing. Benjen said nothing. The right answer to that sentence was no answer at all, and Jon understood this without being told, which was itself a kind of answer. Robert sat with the silence for a long moment. Then he said, without looking up from the table, "I need to think. I need a day. Possibly 2. He looked at Barristan. "The boy and Dayne are guests." "Guests? You understand what that means." Barristan understood what it meant. "Yes, Your Grace." Robert finally looked at Jon one more time. "I am going to ask you a question tomorrow," he said, "or the day after, and I am going to need a straight answer to it. Can you give me straight answers?" "It's the only kind I know," Jon said. Robert looked at him. "You're either telling the truth, or you've been trained to say exactly the things I'd want to hear. I haven't decided which yet." "Then take the time you need," Jon said. "I've waited 16 years. I can wait 2 more days." Robert made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was something shorter and more surprised than a laugh. The sound a man makes when the world catches him off guard in a direction he was not expecting. He stood up, which required slightly more effort than it once would have, and he walked to the door, and he opened it, and he stood in the frame for a moment. He did not say anything else. He left. The room held the four of them, and the documents on the table, and the specific quality of silence that settles after something very large has been set in motion and is now moving under its own weight, past the point where anyone's decision changes what direction it goes. The trial began at the second hour. The seven engaged in the specific chaos of large group fighting, which resembled coordinated combat only in the sense that everyone present had initially intended for it to be coordinated. Within 90 seconds, the field had broken into 3 separate exchanges, with the connective tissue between them dissolving into footwork and positioning and individual decisions made faster than any strategy could account for. Arthur took the center. This was not discussed beforehand. It was simply where Arthur went, and the field organized itself around him the way water organizes around a rock, not because the rock decided to be organizing, but because it was structurally impossible for the field to do anything else. 2 Lannister champions moved toward him in the first 30 seconds. Neither of them was Sandor Clegane, who had the combat intelligence to look at Arthur Dayne standing in the center of a field and find somewhere else to be. Sandor found Jon. He came at Jon from the left side, sword already in motion, with the blunt directness of a man who did not need sophistication, because his primary tools were large enough to make sophistication academic. Jon moved right before the first swing completed, not because he had planned to move right, but because his body had been trained to process and respond before the conscious mind finished the sentence, and his body said right, and right was correct. He got inside Sandor's reach on the third exchange. The space there was wrong, too close for a full sword swing, which was an advantage that lasted exactly as long as it took Sandor to grab Jon's sword arm with his free hand and attempt to remove Jon from the ground entirely. Jon went with it rather than against it. He dropped his weight, turned the grab into a rotation, came back up with his elbow into the junction of Sandor's jaw and neck. It was not a killing blow. It was enough to loosen the grip, which was all it needed to be. Jon was 2 steps back and re-established before Sandor had finished registering the impact. Sandor shook his head. He looked at Jon with the expression of a man who has revised his assessment of a situation. "You're fast," he said, without particular hostility. "You're strong," Jon said. "This is going to take a while." "No," Jon said. "It isn't," and came forward. He was right that it wasn't, and also wrong that he was the one who made it not be. The third serious exchange, Sandor's sword connected with Jon's left shoulder, not blade first, the flat of it, redirected at the last moment, and the impact sent Jon into a stumble that he corrected but not quickly enough. Sandor pressed. Jon backed. The rope boundary was 4 feet behind him. Arthur arrived at Sandor's right flank with no announcement, and the specific economy of a man who had assessed the situation across the field and had made a decision about where he was needed before Jon's stumble had fully registered as a problem. Sandor turned to address the new threat. Jon recovered. Arthur did not need to engage further. The redistribution of attention was the intervention, and it was enough. They ended up back-to-back without planning it, which was not a technique Arthur had ever taught, and not something Jon had ever practiced. It simply happened because the field had arranged itself that way, and the training was comprehensive enough that back-to-back with Arthur Dayne felt like a natural position. Jon faced the 2 remaining Lannister champions. Arthur faced Sandor Clegane. The 2 remaining champions looked at Jon. Then, they looked at each other. Neither of them moved. Then, Barristan Selmy walked onto the field. He walked from the boundary where he had been standing, through the open center of the ground, and came to stand beside Jon. He was unarmed. He carried nothing. He simply walked to where Jon was standing and stood there, facing the 2 Lannister champions, with the expression of a man who has been the best-regarded knight in the 7 Kingdoms for 30 years, and is not remotely uncertain about what his presence on this field means. The 2 champions could not strike an unarmed man without ending any pretense that this proceeding was what it claimed to be. The entire platform of Cersei's argument rested on the language of legitimacy and law and proper procedure. 2 swords through an unarmed Barristan Selmy dissolved that platform completely, and left something much uglier in its place. And everyone on the field understood this simultaneously. The two champions lowered their swords. On the rope boundary, Meryn Trant was already down. 3 northern knights were standing. Sandor Clegane was standing. Arthur Dayne was standing with his sword at his side, breathing in the manner of a man who has been on a moderate walk. Sandor looked at Arthur for a long moment. Then he sheathed his sword. "Another time," he said, without apparent anger. "Yes," Arthur said. Sandor walked off the field. The tourney grounds were completely quiet. The crowd on the surrounding stands, courtiers and lords and servants who had come to watch a legal proceeding and had received something considerably stranger, was still in the way of people who have witnessed something they need more time to categorize. Robert Baratheon stood. He stood up from his chair on the platform and looked at the field, at Jon standing with Barristan Selmy beside him, at Arthur with his sword at his side, at the Lannister champions standing with lowered blades, at the thing the field had produced. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said it simply, in a voice that carried across the tourney grounds without effort, in the voice of a man who is not performing a pronouncement, but stating a conclusion. "The gods have answered." Robert asked his straight question the morning after the trial. He asked it in the small council chamber again, which was his room for decisions, with only Jon and Arthur and Benjen present and the door closed. He came in without ceremony, sat down, put both hands on the table, and looked at Jon the way he had been looking at him since the first day, with the specific attention of a man who is not trying to win anything from the looking, just trying to see clearly. "If I abdicate," Robert said, "my children live. That's the condition. Whatever you believe about their parentage, whatever conclusions a dead hand drew about black hair and golden children, my children are not touched. Joffrey, Tommen, Myrcella, they live. They are provided for. They are not used as pieces in whatever comes after. Can you give me that?" "Yes," Jon said, "without conditions attached." "Without conditions." Robert looked at him. "You don't want to know what I'm offering in return. You're offering to stop contesting a claim that the trial already settled. What you're offering is the easier path. I don't need to negotiate for the easier path." Jon met his eyes steadily. "Your children live because they're children, and they haven't done anything. That doesn't require a trade." Robert sat with that for a moment. He looked at Arthur. "Did you teach him to say things like that?" "I taught him to think," Arthur said. "The things come from the thinking." Robert made the sound again, the short, surprised thing that was not quite a laugh. He looked at the table. Then he stood up and held out his hand across it, and Jon stood and took it, and they gripped once, and it was done. And Robert left the room without speaking further. The abdication took 3 days to formalize. The documents required witnesses and signatures and the involvement of a high septon and 4 lords of sufficient standing to make the record uncontestable. Robert signed everything presented to him without objection. He did not attend the coronation, which Jon had neither expected nor required. He had done what he agreed to do. What came after was Jon's problem. The Sept of Baelor on the morning of the coronation was full and quiet in the specific way of large spaces holding people who are not certain how to feel. They had been told what to feel. The heralds had been thorough. The proclamations had been read in every ward. The case had been made repeatedly and publicly. They knew the logic of what was happening. Logic and feeling travel at different speeds, and most of the people in the Sept were still waiting for the feeling to catch up. Jon walked in without a procession. This had been his decision, made without consulting Arthur, who had noted it and said nothing. A procession required men willing to march in front of a new king's train on the first morning of a new king's reign, and the men willing to do that were largely the men who had been on his side already, and the people who needed to see this were the ones who weren't. He walked in alone. He walked the length of the nave with the candles burning on both sides, and the high septon waiting at the altar and every eye in the sept following him without a word spoken, and he stood before the high septon, and did not arrange his face into anything it didn't naturally produce, which was a 16-year-old with dark hair and gray Stark eyes in a city that had known 3 kings in one lifetime. The high septon spoke the words. Jon gave the responses. The crown was placed, not the formal Targaryen crown that was lost. This was a thing of dark metal commissioned by Jon Arryn from a smith on the Street of Steel in the 2 days between the trial and the abdication. Simple, without ostentation. It sat on Jon's head, and neither of them mentioned what it cost or what it replaced. When the High Septon stepped back, Jon turned to face the Sept. The silence lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then Benjen Stark, standing against the left wall, went to one knee. The 3 northern knights beside him went to one knee. Barristan Selmy, in his white cloak at the back of the Sept, went to one knee. The Sept followed. Not unanimously, not without visible hesitation in certain quarters, not with the roar of men who had been waiting for this specific moment. But they went, and the sound of it, the collective movement of several hundred people lowering themselves toward the stone floor, was its own kind of language, and it said what it needed to say. Jon looked at them all. He said nothing. He had been told by Arthur that the correct thing to do in that moment was nothing, that the impulse to speak, to explain, to justify, was the impulse of a man who was not yet certain he deserved the thing he had just received, and that certainty was exactly what the room needed to see. He stood, and he let them look, and he did not explain himself. This was, Arthur would tell him later, the best thing he did all day. The White Cloak came after. Jon named Arthur Lord Commander of the Kingsguard in the Red Keep's Great Hall that afternoon, with the remaining members of the Kingsguard present and the relevant lords assembled. Arthur received the cloak from Jon's hands and put it on with no ceremony, no words, and no visible alteration of his expression. He had worn white before, he wore it again. The difference was that the previous wearing had been formal, sworn, and ultimately required him to protect a dynasty that was burning itself down from the inside, while this one was chosen with complete information by a man who knew what the wearing cost. He buckled the clasp and stood straight, and that was that. Barristan Selmy remained as senior member. He accepted this arrangement with the equanimity of a man who has spent 62 years making peace with the distance between how things should be and how they are, and who has concluded that peace is the more efficient response. Cersei Lannister did not attend any of it. She had removed herself to her chambers 2 days prior and had not emerged, which was her right and also, Jon suspected, the most sensible choice available to her. There would be conversations. They were not the conversations of this day. Benjen left for the north the following morning. He came to find Jon in the yard before dawn. While the city was still doing what cities do in the last dark hour before light, the specific half-awake murmur of 200,000 people beginning the machinery of another day without being entirely present for it yet. He was already mounted. He had 4 of his men behind him. He was carrying nothing that required explanation. "Robb needs to hear from me," Benjen said. "Not from a raven. From me." "I know," Jon said. "I'll tell him what I told you. What I told Robert." Benjen looked at him from the horse. There was something in his face that had changed since the road south of Winterfell, not softer, precisely, but more at rest, the specific quality of a man whose long argument with the world has found a resting point, even if it hasn't found an end. "He'll come south, eventually. Robb, he'll want to see you himself. I'll be here." Benjen nodded. He looked at Jon for a moment longer. "Your father would have followed you," he said. "Ned, I want you to know that. He would have," he paused, finding the precise word. "He would have understood exactly what you are and followed you without reservation. That's not sentiment. That's the man he was." Jon held it. Did not deflect it or diminish it. "Thank you." Benjen rode out through the gate. Jon watched him go until the sound of hooves was gone and the city had absorbed the space where it had been, and then he stood in the yard alone for a while. The Raven reached Winterfell 3 days later. Robb read it in the Great Hall, standing, the way his father had always read ravens that required immediate understanding rather than consideration. Catelyn was in the room. She read it after him and sat down with it in a manner that suggested the sitting was involuntary, and then she read it again, and did not say anything for a long time. Robb set the letter on the table. He looked at the direwolf banner above the hearth, the gray direwolf on white, the thing his family had been for 8,000 years before any of the rest of it was true. The letter said what it said. Benjen's hand? Benjen's words. It's done. He's real. He's good. Ned would have followed him. Robb read it a third time. Then he set it down again and looked at the hall around him, the stone, the fire, the chair at the head of the table that was his now in the fullest sense. Nobody's regent chair but his own. He sat in it. He sat in it and breathed and let 16 years of a grief he had inherited, without knowing its full shape, find whatever new form it was going to find, now that the shape of the story had changed. He did not cry. He was his father's son. He called for his maester and began dictating his response. Jon was on the balcony of the Red Keep when Arthur found him. The east-facing balcony, the one that caught the first light. The city below was waking up. Fires lit in bakeries, the early market voices, the sounds of a place that was going to be somebody's problem to govern. And the problem was now specifically his. Arthur came to stand beside him. He was wearing the white cloak. Dawn was in his right hand, held at his side. The milk-glass blade had the early light in it the way it always had the light, keeping it rather than reflecting it. Jon looked at it. Arthur held it toward him. Jon took it. Both hands, the familiar assessment. The weight and the balance and the faint warmth of the metal that had no clean explanation. He turned it once. He handed it back. "Still yours," Jon said. Arthur took it. He looked at Jon's face and found nothing there that required a response, which was the correct amount. He set Dawn carefully against the balcony wall. Then he reached inside his cloak and produced a second blade, narrow, Valyrian. Dark as old blood catching the morning light. Where Dawn was pale and warm and luminous, this blade was dark and cool and patient, drinking the light rather than holding it. He had carried it through 16 years of exile, found it in the private collection of a Braavosi merchant in the 3rd year of their wandering, had paid everything he had and settled the remainder in an arrangement that took 3 months to complete. He had mentioned it to no one. He held it out. Jon looked at it for a long moment. He looked at Arthur. Then he took it, both hands, but there was no assessment in it this time. He knew what it was. He had been taught about this blade at 11 years old, in a history lesson whose personal significance he had not understood until now. The weight of it settled into his grip the way the weight of right things settles. Not acquired. "Returned, Dark Sister," Jon said. "Visenya Targaryen's blade," Arthur said. "Lost to history for a generation. It belongs to your line." Jon looked at the blade in his hands. He looked at the city below. 200,000 people beginning their mourning in a place that had housed dynasties and burned them and housed more. He settled his grip. The Valyrian steel was cool and dark and entirely serious in his hands. "What do you need today?" Arthur said. Jon looked at the city. 200,000 people beginning their day in a place that had been governed for 16 years by a man who had been good at fighting and less good at ruling, and before that by a man who had burned people alive in a throne room for entertainment. The small folk in the streets below had lived through both of those things, and adjusted and continued, because the small folk were better at continuity than kings gave them credit for, but they deserved better than adjustment. "I need to start," Jon said. "Then start." They stood there while the light came fully in, and the city below filled with the morning noise of itself, and the problem of it. The magnificent, impossible, necessary problem of it stretched out in every direction as far as anyone could see. The north is cold and full of whispers, and on this morning, for the first time in 16 years, the whispers had an answer. The boy born in secret at a forgotten tower had come home, not with a lie, not with a borrowed army, but with the proof of everything he was carved into his bones by the greatest swordsman who ever lived. They called him Aegon. They called him the 6th of his name. Some called him a ghost. Some called him the son of ice and fire. But in the Red Mountains, in the years when the world was not watching, there had been a simpler name for him. A private name, used only at the end of a training session when the master was satisfied. Arthur Dayne called him Jon. And Jon had made it enough. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.